All right, and we're ready to go. And there are. I'll just start by noting, as you can see, I'm going to continue with the Making Democracy Work lecture series. I believe we're on lecture number 4 now. It's with a somewhat heavy heart that I have to note that there's been a resumption of hostilities, resumption of warfare in the Gaza Strip, and the images that come out as a result are heartbreaking. The short interlude of uh, less casualties, more aid making its way in, hostages being released, certainly shows what is possible if we can find a way to get this conflict under control. But in the meantime, I don't expect that's going to happen anytime soon. And so at some point soon, we'll come back and talk more about that. I'll also just note that for the next couple of weeks, there is a conference of the participants on the International Framework for Climate Change Control under the auspices of the United Nations, occurring in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and that there are some important developments occurring there. And I'm going to wait a little while both to update us on climate change, which of course I continue to regard as the most important issue facing humanity in the 21st century, because it is the most likely existential threat to our capacity to remain on the planet. But not this week. Let's let a little bit more time go by before we start to take stock of that. Today, I will say a little bit more about 2024, the upcoming American presidential elections, just to kind of rehash a little bit what we covered last week. But I think it's worthwhile noting that the clock is ticking on the buildup to the Iowa primary, which appears to be the last best hope that the Republicans have of nominating somebody other than Donald Trump. And by the way, the clock is ticking on 2024 for the Democrats too. The question of whether Joe Biden is the man of the moment is being raised with increasing urgency in many quarters. Does he have the fire in the belly? Does he channel the mood of the moment in ways that allow him to effectively lead the country going into 2024 in the way that he did succeed in 2020, or as one columnist recently put it, are the Democrats whistling past the graveyard and believing that Biden can do it again? So those are all things that we'll talk about going forward. Today, I want to reemphasize the idea that I believe that in a sense, the 2024 election, to stay on that theme for a moment, will not be won by Joe Biden, or at least he's not going to play to his strengths if he makes it a reform on Bidenomics or his first term in office. And that may not be fair. There's certainly a lot that Joe Biden deserves credit for in terms of revitalizing American industrial policy and thereby creating record job growth, and doing so in a period in which there's both a global pandemic and once in a 50-year resurgence of inflation. And yet, um, as we studied last week, as I'll refresh our memory on this week, Biden's performance in the economy is not well regarded by most Americans. And frankly, if he makes his campaign about that issue, then he is walking right into the place where Donald Trump most wants to fight him. So the second thing I'll say very quickly is that I don't think Joe Biden can simply run the campaign he ran in 2020 to say Donald Trump is a threat to American democracy, to individuals, to groups, to institutions that he clearly wants to persecute and tear down. And not that that isn't any less true, or even perhaps more true and more dangerous in 2024 than it was in 2020, But to be as clear as possible, I think 4 years on into the politics of having restored normality to Washington, D.C., and in particular, the Oval Office and the executive branch, most Americans don't see that there have been great benefits to doing so, right? And so, exactly what is it that Joe Biden is fighting to save in 2024? And so that leads me to this third issue, which is that as opposed to simply playing defense or trying to campaign on the basis of economic policy that frankly most Americans do not view as having benefited them, even if the macroeconomic data suggests that it's been good for our country as a whole. Joe Biden needs to find something that resonates. And obviously, I don't have a phone line to the White House. I don't have any real capacity to influence this, but I'm going to at least argue with you that I think defending democracy by modernizing democracy, by democratizing democracy, by making democracy a viable institutional form for empowering people to feel that they have fate, control over their own fate in the 21st century might just be the best path available to Joe Biden. I say this as a political theorist and not as a campaign strategist. I say this as someone who's not workshopped it in various focus groups. It is just a sense of the moment that's informing this view. And so I am reusing images that we've looked at before, right? Images that I like to think contrast a more inclusive cooperative economy with an economy that simply pushes out its marginal and disposable people so as not to have to care about or even look at them. And that what we need, in essence, in the 21st century, is a form of democracy strong enough, a form of democracy empowered enough, a form of democracy inclusive enough that most people come to believe that democracy can reshape their lives to make their work, their leisure, their medical care more fair, more sustainable, more inclusive, and that in essence is what the Diego Rivera painting represents, as opposed to the Pierre Monet painting representing a form of economics and politics that simply pushes the marginal out. So last week we talked about the distressing data coming in these early polls. This is not predictive of what's going to happen in 2024. I want to be as clear as possible. But what it does make clear is that in the winter of 2023, as we look forward to 2024, what most people see is a contest between two deeply unpopular leaders, neither of which they're very happy with. And frankly, they are split down the middle between voting for one or the other while holding their nose, or perhaps voting for a third party candidate. And the upshot of all of this is that Donald Trump appears at this early stage to have a real and quite substantial lead in many of the most important swing states where this election will be decided. And the fact that a man who is increasingly clear in articulating his authoritarian aspirations, his desire to put 10 million Americans in detainment centers, right? To undo the constraint of the rule of law on the executive, to use the Department of Justice to go after his rivals and quote enemies. That this is an unbridled authoritarian leader who is saying it all out loud while facing 91 felony indictments. That this man is running neck and neck with the incumbent, I think is clearly an indication that something is amiss in our democracy. That's the way I'm reading it, not as a prediction about 2024. I suggested to you that part of what is hampering Joe Biden is the effort to run on the basis of his economic strengths. And I am pointing out to you, right, that part of the problem with doing so is that Joe Biden's presidency coincides with the return of inflation, and inflation has outpaced wage growth for almost the entirety of his presidency. I will point out that the fact that this is now inverted in 2023, it's not a big gap, but at least inflation is not actively corroding our purchasing power anymore, that's a good sign for Joe Biden. And if that continues, that may increase his capacity to make this argument, which I think is a weak argument. I point you to Karen Petru's interesting book, The Engine of Inequality, from which a couple of these diagrams are derived. And then also a book I've spoken with you about before, Muhammad El-Arian's The Only Game in Town. And I think what's important let me just dig down on this for a second as I transition to the next diagram, which shows, I think, the fundamental problem, which is how deeply skewed and unequal our economy is. What's important in both Petru and El-Arian's analysis is that for the last 20 odd years, not only the US Congress, but legislatures in many parts of the democratic world have been too polarized and paralyzed to enact good economic legislation, that the result is that the job of keeping the economy working has been primarily played by national banks. In our country, our case, the Federal Reserve, and that their policy toolkit is incredibly narrow. It's essentially lower interest rates, increase the money supply, maybe quantitative easing, another way of increasing the supply of money. And those policies tend to be most beneficial for those who make money by investing. It lowers their costs of using leverage, and therefore the primary tool of economic policy for the last 20 years at least, whether or not it has been intended to work this way, has been an inequality promoting and accelerating tool. And so we see this again in this diagram, which shows you very clearly that the top 1% have basically a third of the wealth in the United States. The top 10% have 2/3 of the wealth. The bottom 50% a vanishingly small, less than 3% of the wealth. I think anybody looking at this, I don't know, a libertarian so convinced of market justice that they think that this is fair, right, good, a way to um, promote the welfare of our society, a way to encourage functional politics. This just on its face says there's something amiss in our economy. And the books that I point you to by Petru and El-Arian suggest, yes, what's amiss is that the very project of regulating the economy, of passing policy to create fairer and more inclusive forms of growth and economic security has really broken down quite a while ago. And so if Biden really wants to be able to claim that his program of middle out or bottom up economics is going to work to restore the working class to economic security, to restore the idea of opportunity to the United States, then he has to fix democracy. He has to be able to pass legislation that addresses this situation. And by the way, right, in a situation, right, where the majority, I'm sorry, the plurality say that they are worse off than they were a year ago by almost a 2-to-1 ratio, outnumbering those who say they're better off, that's really strong headwinds to go into a presidential campaign. Maybe this will get a little bit better, but having said that, I think that the underlying problem is not going to be fixed by doubling down on Bidenomics unless there's a capacity to actually pass good economic legislation in the middle of the 21st century, and that requires fixing democracy. And so I won't dwell on this. This is stuff we've looked at before. We're in the middle of a democratic recession, and the core point I want to make here, right, which is that we've seen a large number of countries autocratizing in the 2020s, a much smaller number of countries democratizing as opposed to in the past. And what that means is moving from liberal democracy to illiberal democracy to dictatorship, right? That's the Russian trajectory, but maybe increasingly the Hungarian trajectory, the Turkish trajectory, and then let us hope that it's not the Italian or the French or the Dutch trajectory. But having said all of that, I think we have to recognize that there's no reason to believe that the United States is immune from following this path, and that the forces pushing other countries away from democracy are very much at work in the United States. Economic inequality and the sense that the institutions that we have are impotent, incapable of promoting fair economic growth, security, and a decent life have led people to withdraw support from those institutions in a sense, understandably. There's a book I'm looking at right now. I'll grab it for you so I can use a prompt real quick. I particularly like the title. Astra Taylor's Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It when it's gone. I think that's a very accurate indication of what happens. And I don't have the data here today, but I can rehash with you the idea that 20 years ago, almost 50% of the world lived in societies that can be categorized as democratic. And today it's closer to 20% of the world, right? And so from a perspective of human well-being, I think this is a change for the worse. We need to figure out how to fix our democracy to make it work better. And I think, frankly, there's no better time than a presidential election to begin that conversation. So I've spoken with you about briefly the idea that there are two different approaches that seem to me to be the most promising approaches, in a sense, to indicate the main options available to us. One of them involves repairing the institutions that we already have so that they work better. And those institutions, in our case, refer primarily to our federal government and the Constitution that structures those institutions. So constitutional reform or reform of the federal government in the 21st century, that's path one. Path two is saying essentially that these are old institutions. They're crafted for a simpler time, a time perhaps when the social and cultural forces of our society were less hostile to democracy, and therefore we could have weaker institutions. And frankly, we know that these institutions were crafted by people who both were tempted by but also mistrustful of democracy, and so they tempered their democratic elements with much less democratic elements. We're going to get into this in a moment, but it's worthwhile noting, right, that the same people who decided that we should have a House of Representatives that functioned on the principle of one person, one vote, and proportionate representation. Also gave us the Senate, and remember that that was originally and until the last century non-elected institution, right? And so checking democracy with essentially an aristocratic or oligarchic institution, we don't have those fears about democracy so much in the 21st century. Let me express it this way. Perhaps something more dangerous than the rule of the majority is present in the 21st century, and that is a majority that believes it should rule, but feels that it is thwarted in its capacity to rule, and therefore becomes angry, aggrieved, and looks to populists to better empower them. So, in thinking about how to fix our democracy, I turn to two of the most interesting comparative political scientists working these days, Daniel Sablat and Stephen Levitsky, the authors of How Democracies Die, that we've talked about a fair bit before, that gives us the profile of a leader who is democratically elected within a democracy, but who has autocratic tendencies and then uses the power that they gain via election to try to undermine democracy. And their conclusion that Donald Trump is the president in the entire history of the United States that best fits the profile of an aspiring autocrat. And I just point out to you, this book was written in 2017 when perhaps Donald Trump was trying to do a little bit more to hide or tame those aspects and impulses of his personality. And the Donald Trump of 2023 is even more obviously an aspiring autocrat. And so this book was primarily diagnostic and an effort to try to indicate, while we have someone like Trump in the White House, how should we anticipate that he will act in order to be able to protect ourselves from him. In an earlier book, Zablat had pointed out that the commitment of conservative parties to democracy, to the idea that when they lose elections, they have to relinquish power and give the other side their turn to rule and govern, that commitment is a main predictor of democratic health, of democratic stability, or alternatively, that when conservative parties are instrumental in their commitment to democracy, we will be very happy to be elected and retain power as long as we can via elections. But should we start losing elections, then we aren't going to be fans of elections so much anymore, right? And that kind of conservative party, which Zablat suggests you have in Spain and Italy and Germany in the first third of the 20th century, often spells the doom for democracy. And I think part of what is so concerning in 2023, 2024, is it's no longer just Donald Trump. I think in the early years of Trump's term in office, it was still the case that many in his party were frightened of him, were trying to restrain him, were therefore checking him as best they could. And those included many people in his own administration. As you know, if you're looking at Project 2025, and I can't believe that the once, I think, at least credible Heritage Foundation has gone over to essentially engineering the dismantling of checks and balances for Donald Trump, right? So very mainstream Republican think tanks going over to becoming essentially MAGA institutions, but the Republican Party as a whole has been recast in the mold of Donald Trump, We see this especially in the House of Representatives and its current leadership, but we see it more generally in the way in which Republicans across the country are campaigning and the beliefs of ordinary voters. And so the threat in 2024, 2025 is, I think, much more grave. And this leads Levitsky and Zablat in their most recent book, published just this year, to indicate an alternative approach, fixing the institutions that are giving us the Republican Party of Donald Trump. And so that's where I'll focus, at least for the first part of the lecture today. And we talked about this last week. I don't want to go um, through all of this again in detail, but the core idea that it's perilous work for a political party when it recognizes that its current coalition no longer constitutes a reliable electoral majority, right? That it sees the writing on the wall that if it simply maintains its current politics, it will increasingly be a minority party. But how does it reconstitute its base? How does it rebuild its coalition without alienating key members of its current coalition while trying to bring in new members? That's just a really hard rope to walk. And many parties fail in doing that. If there's a way not to have to do that, you can understand why a political party would resist the risky business of reconstituting its coalition in the midst of fighting, contesting elections. And what then Levitsky and Zablat suggest is that actually the American Constitution and various policies open the door for minority rule and have allowed the Republican Party to resist the competitive pressure to reconstitute its coalition. And the fact that the Senate over represents the smaller states and gives them the capacity to exercise power disproportionately over policy. The fact that, in addition to that, unlike, say, Britain, the upper house, the Senate, is co equal to the lower house, not a rubber stamp body or merely a checking body, but in fact a co equal legislative body. And therefore, as we have seen in recent history, the Senate is the place that progressive legislation goes to either die or to be radically damped down in its expectations, its call for and program for reform. We see this with healthcare legislation. We see this with gun control legislation. We see this with campaign finance reform. I could keep going, right? The Senate has been the brake on more progressive or radical reform proposals on a whole array of policy issues. Add to the fact that it's unrepresentative, that it amplifies minority power, the fact that it has internal rules like the filibuster that allow the minority to block legislation, and you get a doubly conservative institution. You add to that that the president can veto legislation, that the president is elected not by the majority of the popular vote, but by the Electoral College. Recognize that the Republicans have only won the popular vote once for the presidency in the 21st century, and yet they have held essentially an equal number of terms in the presidency. And then add that the president has veto power and can so block the legislation that manages to get out of the Senate. And again, you've got a capacity to prevent new legislation, a capacity for the minority to continue to be empowered, even when it can't reconstitute itself as a majority. Of course, we have the Supreme Court, an unelected, unaccountable small body of individuals appointed by presidents who are elected by the Electoral College, confirmed by the Senate, who, right, is over representative of small states. And you've got another break on democracy, another encouragement for the strategy of minority rule. You finally add that in the Constitution, the power to regulate elections, to design electoral districts and institutions is given to the states, and that many states, particularly conservative states, are tempted to use that power to shape their electoral process, to amplify the power of the minority, of the Republican Party, of whites often and more conservative older people. And you've got yet a further rot in American democracy. Finally, and I want to just focus on this for a second because it seems to me that this is perhaps the most important impediment, because in order to fix any of the above, except for the filibuster, we probably need constitutional amendments. And yet our constitution is the hardest constitution to amend in the democratic world. The fact that you need super majorities in both houses of Congress and then still larger super majorities in the states to get um, any amendment to the Constitution passed means that it's much easier to play defense than offense. It's much easier to block political reform than it is to conduct it. And so you take all of this together, and it opens the possibility of self-reinforcing minority rule. The possibility that the party that gets the minority of the vote will nevertheless end up in power, that once in power, it will reinforce all of these dimensions in order to be able to maintain itself as a viable political force, despite the fact that it doesn't attract majority support. And then finally add that, by the way, the Republican Party in the 21st century has explicitly embraced this strategy, and that it is increasingly both anti-institutional and authoritarian as a result, and that a larger portion of rank and file voters in the Republican Party seem to be falling in line with this partisan strategy. You have a real problem for democracy. Very quickly, again, to review, race is a second big component of this story. We've already talked about inequality and about the anger at the failure of our institutions and the Democratic Party in particular to use their power to create a more inclusive, fair form of economic growth. Second big issue that is leading, right, the Republican Party in this direction of minoritarianism is the fact that it's much more appealing to whites than it is to people of color, as this data shows. And of course, our country is rapidly diversifying, rapidly becoming a multiracial democracy. And I think this is really important to emphasize that the majority of Americans are not adverse to that. They either consider it to be a neutral phenomenon or a positive development. And it's the minority whose power is amplified, who is resistant to the diversification of America. We see this very clearly in the data on the polarization of white voters with regards to racial resentment. And what we see is that Democratic whites have become less resentful recently, and those who have high levels of racial resentment are now a decided minority within the white Democratic voters, whereas Republican voters have actually maintained or even become more racially resentful. And this is part of the electoral appeal of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has brought into the Republican Party those voters who have high levels of hostility towards African Americans, Hispanics, Muslims, and gays. And those voters, if they believe that they have a leader who hears them and who amplifies their animosity and anxiety about the direction the country is headed in will turn out to vote. They can be mobilized. And this is why the Republican Party seems almost structurally determined to move in the direction of populist authoritarianism as long as it's trying to win elections while relying primarily on a white electorate, a white constituency. It has to get all of those voters out. How does it do that? By mobilizing their animosity. In addition to that, the third factor, we've got economic inequality, we've got racial diversification, we've also got the fact that we are moving in the direction of being a post-traditional society, a society in which the values of one generation are not automatically taken as given by the next generation, including values central to our social identities, things like religion, things like how we perform or enact our gender roles, things to do with sexuality, with the family, with marriage, with so-called family and traditional values. And again, many of us welcome that. Many of us are, in fact, celebrating the move into a freer kind of culture. But a large minority of us is threatened by these developments, and they are trying to use law, the state, policy, coercion to reimpose tradition once it is no longer voluntarily or organically reproduced, once we don't just want to continue to maintain it, you can force people to maintain it by, for instance, preventing them from gaining access to abortion or birth control, or preventing them of learning of alternatives in their schools. And so abortion politics, anti-woke politics is key to this strategy of mm, manifesting and mobilizing animosity to people. LGBTQ is kind of the convenient scapegoat, but more generally to a culture that is increasingly less traditional. So, how do these institutions that amplify the power of the minority actually work? We start with, and again, I'm assuming this is familiar, the Electoral College, right? And I think the Electoral College does two things that are distinct but related and important to see. The first is that it overrepresents the less populous states, right? And so this is indicated on this diagram. I'll give you another diagram that makes this much clearer in a moment by the color, right? The deeper the green, the more power per voter is conferred by the Electoral College. The whiter or paler the color of the state, the less power it has. And so the least populous states are most overrepresented by the Electoral College. But secondly, and I think this is distinct and important to note, it fractures the vote by peculiar geographic containers. It's just so happens to be the case that Wyoming gets, in ways that we'll see in just a moment, more than three times the punching power in presidential elections in the United States in the 21st century than California gets. And it so happens also to be the case that Wyoming is whiter, older, more conservative than California. And so it's not just that the small state is more powerful, it's because of who lives where and what their ideological beliefs are that this institution of ours, this 18th century strange institution, the Electoral College, is amplifying minority power. This is, I think, a clearer way of visualizing this. And I'll just spend a moment on this, right? Wyoming, smallest state by population, uh, gets one electoral college vote per 135,000 voters, roughly. That is because Wyoming is guaranteed one member of the House of Representatives, even though its population is so small that if it were in California, it wouldn't by itself constitute an electoral district. And it gets two electoral college votes for each of its senators, right? So three electoral college votes, meaning that each 135,000 people get one electoral college vote. In California, that's one electoral college vote for 410,000 people, right? And so, right, California is shrunk to a tiny proportion of its actual size to represent its relative disempowerment in the electoral college. Second institution here, again, familiar, the Senate. And please note, right, that you have 62 senators who represent the same number of people as 6 senators. So again, punching 10 times above the weight, the low population senators as opposed to the high senators representing high population states. And again, because of the peculiar distribution of our population across our states, the result is that the Senate overrepresents whites, underrepresents Hispanics and Blacks, overrepresents especially non-college educated whites relative to their proportion of the population. And the result of all of this can be measured objectively in two different ways. One of them is just in terms of the geographic feature of the people under and overrepresented in the Senate. Those who live in urban areas, about 25% of our population, are underrepresented in the Senate. They only get about 14% of the Senate seats. Those who live in rural areas, also a quarter of our population, are dramatically overrepresented in the Senate. They get over a third of the Senate seats. And again, given the peculiar demographic and ideological geography, political geography of the United States, the consequence of this is that the US Senate is considerably more conservative than the American population as a whole. This is where the median voter is on an ideological scale that goes from plus 10 liberal to plus 10 conservative. Zero is the middle, right? And the Senate is over plus 5 conservative. And again, this means that the Senate is a crucial break on reform, and as we're about to see, a crucial distorting influence on the third major institution, the judiciary. And again, just to make it as clear as possible, the president appoints the members of the Supreme Court. Over the course of the 21st century, there has been one Republican president who won the popular vote. By the way, he had already been president. He was running as an incumbent, which is easier because he won without winning the popular vote, but winning the electoral college vote. And by the way, with some help from the Supreme Court. So one Republican president, and yet the members of the Supreme Court appointed by Republicans have a 6-3 super majority. Then add that they are confirmed by the Senate, that the Senate is particularly disproportionate and as a result, especially conservative. And what we'll see in just a moment is that this shapes the entire federal judiciary, but it in particular shapes the Supreme Court. We have a significant portion of the Supreme Court who were appointed by presidents who won the electoral college vote but lost the popular vote, and confirmed by senators who represent only a minority of the population. And of course, the Supreme Court may be the most functional institution in the federal government right now, the most powerful institution, because it can invalidate laws it doesn't like. And I apologize maybe for putting that in somewhat crass terms, but some of their recent doctrine, like the major questions doctrine, seem to me to be so underdetermined that it really is the case, essentially, that the Supreme Court is acting as a third legislative body that is exclusively a veto body that seems to be deciding things often on grounds that I have a hard time rooting in constitutional considerations. I'm just going to point out very briefly that I think that there's a looming issue in American politics, and that is the rightward movement of the federal judiciary as a whole, not just the Supreme Court, that coincides with a period in which many Americans are still in the center or moving to the left. And so, as you can see, right, Democratic presidents are constrained to appoint moderates to the bench because they have to get them through the Senate. Republican presidential presidents don't encounter that constraint, and therefore, as you can see, their appointments cluster on the right. And the big issue, I think, is going to be if Democrats manage to pass progressive legislation in the coming decade, it may very well be consistently invalidated by the courts. We may very well be back to the early 1930s in terms of that dynamic. And so what we see, in addition to the rightward drift of the judiciary, the undemocratic, unaccountable, and skewed representation or appointment of the Supreme Court, is that the Supreme Court is increasingly shaping the rules of the game of American politics, and doing so in a way that seems almost predictably partisan, predictably advantageous to the party of the president who appointed the judge, right? The things that are most beneficial to the Republican Party seem to be upheld by Republican appointed members of the Supreme Court. This includes the Bush v. Gore decision, right? Directly deciding the outcome of a presidential election. The Citizens United decision, which has opened the floodgates for money in American politics, particularly unregulated dark money. And the result has been that billionaires who tend to be more conservative, anti-regulatory, anti-redistribution, have become much more influential in American politics. We have the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in Shelby v. Holder. And please note that there's another really important federal decision that may strip the right, I'm sorry, federal court decision that may strip the right of individuals or non-governmental organizations, groups like the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Legal Center, from bringing suits against states that appear to be engaged in racial voter suppression or racial gerrymandering. And we will have to see how that plays out if it reaches the Supreme Court. But right now, that's the holding of a federal court. We have a couple different decisions essentially making it much more difficult for unions to operate as a countervailing force to corporations and rich individuals in working through American politics, and in general making it much more difficult to organize unions. And I'll stop there, but I hope you begin to see, right, a political process that disproportionately empowers minorities, influences the composition of the court. The court, in turn, hands down decisions that makes it easier for the minority to continue to be disproportionately represented. This is that self-reinforcing feedback loop that I've been talking about and that Levitsky and Sablat call our attention to. Final issue here, gerrymandering. And this is fortunately not as bad at the level of the House of Representatives in the 2020s as it was in the 2010s. but it is still a really powerful issue in many state politics. As you can see, I've tried to illustrate this with Wisconsin, and there are ways of measuring, right, how much more the seats awarded are than the vote garnered is in Wisconsin. And so one way to put this is the Democrats might have to win 60% of the vote to get 51% of the representation in the assembly in Wisconsin. It's that gerrymandered. And as you can see, right, for most of the last decade, not so bad in the current decade, Republicans have had their vote amplified in representation in the House of Representatives due to gerrymandering. So, having said all of that, Levitsky and Zablat's analysis suggests that the drift of the Republican Party further and further to the right, the growing wing of the party that is authoritarian, that is populist, that is governed by the MAGA Republicans is directly explicable by this feature of American democracy, that it overrepresents the minority and hence makes minority tyranny possible. And in ways we've talked about before, different histories of the Republican Party over the last 100 years or conservative politics in the United States point out the way in which mainstream Republicans have ultimately been outflanked by more populist extremist movements within the party. This is reflected in how many Republicans were willing to repeat the obvious disinformation that the 2020 election was stolen, who then regarded the indictments against Trump as pure political maneuvers and not as having any basis in the law. And I'll just point out to you very quickly what I consider to be the worst and scariest aspect of this, which is that if you look at contemporary polls, the fact that Donald Trump is in so much legal trouble, right, is facing both civil and criminal trials that are in process, at least building up to the days in court in the criminal cases, actually currently in court in the civil case, and things do not seem to be going his way, right? And the way in which Donald Trump has defended himself is to say that he is being prosecuted only because he stands up for people who the deep state, the liberals, the elites are biased against, and that they are using the power of the state to take him down so he can no longer be an advocate for ordinary Americans who have been unfairly treated by a rigged economy and rigged political system. And when you do these polls, right, 88% of Democrats say the reason that Donald Trump is being prosecuted is because that's what's required to uphold the rule of law. But 56% of Republicans say the reason Donald Trump is being prosecuted is because it's the best way to attack people like you by removing your advocate. And the reason I find this in particular to be so distressing is because if people become convinced that the Department of Justice is merely doing the dirty work of the political party that is currently in power, if they become convinced that the federal judiciary is not an institution that impartially administers the law, but that instead is also completely politically instrumentalized, just the hit job for the deep state, then what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Why shouldn't, if Donald Trump is reelected, he be able to use the Department of Justice to go after his rivals, use the courts to take down his enemies. And to be as clear as possible, this is exactly what he is saying he wants to do. And he is suggesting it's already being done by the other side. So payback is fair play. And his base seems to be convinced. I think the only thing that's encouraging in this is the fact that it's not a super majority. It's 56% who believe this. It's not as lopsided as it is with the Democrats who believe that this is what I think it accurately is described as upholding the rule of law. So having covered all of that, let me now turn to Levitsky and Zablat's recommendations. And I'm going to at least get through this portion of them. That there's a list that I've divided in half because I think there's some things that are easy and some things that are hard. And I want to adequately uh, analyze and try to indicate which belongs to which. And so the first recommendation they make, have a constitutional amendment to establish a right to vote. And here I have to say, on its face, this should be easy to do, right? It's a peculiar feature of our 18th century Constitution that it does not protect our rights to vote. I think many Americans are actually surprised to find that this is not in the Constitution, that there is no constitutional amendment, for instance, that establishes a right to vote. On the other hand, I have to say, and I'll come back to this, amending the Constitution is extraordinarily difficult. And so any proposal for fixing democracy that involves amending the Constitution faces a bottleneck. It's very difficult to get the supermajority of both houses of Congress and the supermajority of the states to agree on anything. And so if your proposal for fixing American democracy involves amending the Constitution, you need to tell me why that's a realistic possibility in the 21st century. I'm not convinced it is, even on something as seemingly innocuous as constitutionalizing the right to vote. Second idea, automatic voter registration. And these ideas all amount essentially to ideas to promote voting, to make it easier for the majority to actually vote so that we're not as likely to have our politics distorted by a highly mobilized minority. So if everybody is automatically, when they turn 18, registered to vote, it's just done via a national database in the way that it's done in most democracies in the world. You don't have to go through all of this rigmarole, voter registration campaigns. Do you have the right documents? Do you get to the DMV on time to actually be able to vote in the next election? That's a peculiar impediment to democracy in the United States. Third, expand mail-in and early voting, right? We did a lot of this during the pandemic. Can we do it again in the post-pandemic environment in order to maximize the ease of voting for Americans? By the way, along the similar lines, make the election day a day off. And there are two ways to do that. One of them is to make the first Tuesday in November a national holiday. That does not involve a constitutional amendment. Therefore, that's probably the more likely path. The alternative is to make voting on a Sunday when most people are already off, but frankly, that involves constitutional amendment, and that may be more difficult. So you take the first four together, and this is just basically trying to get it as easy as possible for the majority to influence their franchise, their right to equal influence over the outcome of elections. Fifth, restore voting rights to felons. And I should have looked this up. I believe there are still 17 states that disenfranchise felons. Some of those states, like Florida, that have moved away from disenfranchising felons, still make it very difficult for felons to regain the right to vote. This would be a way, again, of allowing the majority the access to the ballot that would allow it to exercise proportionate power over our politics, restore national level voting rights protection. And so the idea here is that the Voting Rights Act has been significantly diminished by the Holder v. Shelby decision, and that it continues to be under stress from the federal judiciary, pass new voting rights legislation, recognizing that one of the main strategies of the Republican Party in the 21st century is to suppress the vote. And finally, on this list, replace partisan with nonpartisan electoral administration. And as you may be aware, right, many of the officials who regulate elections, who administer elections, who are in charge of the positioning of electoral, of balloting machines, of stations, who are in charge of counting the vote, are elected officials and partisan officials. And this creates a great deal of suspicion that they might want to put their finger on the scale, hence mistrust of our electoral institutions. In addition, it creates the great temptation to try to get somebody elected who may put their finger on the scale to advantage your party. And so we put all of that together, and you've got a list of what I'm going to call majority empowerment proposals, right? And I think I should probably leave off there for today. I will just point out to you that there are an additional set of proposals here that have to do with further democratizing our democracy. And as I say, I think of the first seven as being more attainable, realistic within our current political environment. The next eight, I guess it is, are I think going to be more difficult to accomplish. And so that's where we'll pick up next week. But let me just conclude with one more thought. And as I said, if you propose, for instance, amending the Constitution to establish the right to vote, it's pretty straightforward to write that in a book. But if we're actually committed to fixing democracy, it's obviously insufficient to leave that as ink on paper. It has to become actual political campaign material. It has to be something that is actively pursued via a social movement that opens up a path to it being realistic. And so I'm just going to suggest to you that one of the central reasons to consider what I'm calling the second fork of democratic reform, not fixing what is worn down and dysfunctional in our antiquated constitutional machinery, but instead exploring institutional alternatives that can be created to operate next to and to modify without reforming our constitutional machinery, is precisely because it may be more attainable in the 21st century. Let me stop there and see what questions or thoughts you have. Who wants to start us out today? Sorry, I'm waiting for the screen to shift. I think it's about to. There we go. John, you've got balloons going. How did that happen?
They weren't my balloons. I don't know whose balloons they were. I have no idea where those balloons came from.
That was an illusion, right? That was something that Zoom put
There
in.
are no, in the sense, there are no balloons here. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was a nice effect. Whoever did it, thank you.
However,
Go ahead, John. Nice to see you again.
speaking of illusions, I'm listening. Your diagnosis of all of our problems are, as usual, right on target. I think we can all agree with them, how bad things are. Your proposals, both the big sort of big ones and then that last little list of electoral reforms at the end, are ones that we can all applaud. But you said at the beginning that you're not trying to give suggestions to Biden's campaign managers. But are you thinking somehow that some appeal in the presidential election based on these sorts of proposals have any chance whatsoever of attracting votes? I mean, of course they would attract some votes. They'd attract all the progressives with no trouble, and of course the right wing would be very much against it. But it's the election is a question of getting all the moderate people, so-called moderate people, in the middle, and they need some issue, negative or positive, that's going to set their blood on fire. And I can't see this one myself.
Well, John, I'm going to start with a slight modification of what you said. I didn't say I'm not trying to influence Biden's advisors. I'm saying it's not very likely that I'm going to influence Biden's advisors, right? I don't have their phone numbers in my cell phone. But so then I am suggesting, and to be as clear as possible, I don't think, right, that we're in a political moment, and so I go back to Bill Clinton, for instance, as, right, the person who would give the State of the Union address that would have 20 detailed policy reform proposals in it. I don't think that works very well in the 2020s, right? So Joe Biden certainly can't, I think, win an election based on detailed proposals for changing the administration of elections, right? But I do think the general claim, democracy isn't empowering the people to accomplish what it wants. And the alternative is, on the one hand, losing faith in democracy and throwing our allegiance in with a populist who says that democracy is the problem, right? Or alternatively, fixing our democracy. And I do think, and maybe I'm letting the fact that I'm a democratic theorist shape my assessment of political strategy. I just think, what is available to Biden? I don't think he can run on the economy, right? I don't think merely Trump is a threat works as well in 2024 as it worked in 2020, despite the fact that Trump is probably more of a threat in 2020. I don't think if saying that Trump is a threat is all there is to be said, right? We need to protect against him, as opposed to, we need not only to protect against him, but we need to also recognize the kernel of truth in what his supporters are saying, which is they don't think that this system works for them. And if that's all we've got, then they might as well send somebody to Washington who's going to try to stir it up or tear it down, as opposed to fix it. So yes, I am saying that. And your question leads me to immediately think, maybe this is not the best approach. I just don't see another good approach available for Biden. And frankly, this is a motif of many of the things we've talked about over the last 5-6 years. The Democrats have great policy ideas, let's say. I think they have many good policy ideas. They can't get them passed, right? And so at some point, just saying to your constituency again and again and again, here are our great policy ideas, vote for us, when everybody knows that these policy ideas are not going to be implemented isn't a very good strategy, right? And so can you address the reason that those policy proposals are dead on arrival, even if the Democrats win the presidency, the House, and the Senate? Dead because they're going to be filibustered, dead because the Senate, even if it's controlled by the Democrats, has the Joe Manchins in it who are going to demand that half the good stuff be eliminated, dead because the Supreme Court is going to overturn key provisions in your legislation if it doesn't like them, right? And so at some point we have to say, look, the problem isn't only winning the next election. The problem is translating electoral support into the capacity to actually legislate. And American democracy doesn't allow us to do that right now. That's the question. How do you convey that as an effective campaign issue? I guess that's why I'm a political theorist and not a campaign advisor. But yes, from my perspective, that has to be part of what we're talking about when we fight these fights.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, John. It's a good question. And I'm doing my best, but I do think you're identifying a real weakness to the argument. Thank you. Flossie, you raised your hand. Go ahead, but unmute yourself first. You're not unmuted, Flossie. Got to hold the space bar down.
Right here.
There you go. Got it.
What worries me is what is happening to the language of our country. We have, it used to be the Republican Party was the party of gentlemen. And now we have Chuck Grassley talking about the crap and having people fall on their ass. They're starting to speak like thugs. That happened to the Nazis too. The thugs took over. The gentlemen have disappeared. And then you have kooks who feel that they're doing God's work if they support Trump. So if Trump wants to appoint a lunatic to be his district attorney, and the guy feels that he's not suited, one of Trump's gentlemen says it may be that he's doing God's work and he should go ahead and do it. So you've got criminals and lunatics. Does that worry me? Not really, because the world is crazy anyway.
I didn't see that conclusion coming, Flossie, but yes, I do think the degree of vitriol, and I tried to point to some of what is at work here, and I'll just point out, right, in a sense, I think the best hope for assuming Joe Biden is the candidate of the Democratic Party, and I really do worry, right, that he's just not the man for this moment, despite the fact that he's been a very effective president in many respects. But we've been down this path once. We put Hillary Clinton up against Donald Trump, and despite the fact that she was eminently qualified, she could not connect with the electorate in a way that allowed us to avoid what I think is the catastrophe of the Trump first term. That part of the reason that Trump is so electorally powerful is he brings those people in who really are looking for a scapegoat, who really dislike the direction the country is taking, dislike what it's doing to them, and want to be as clear as possible. It's people not like me who are at fault. It's people like them, right? And part of what restrained the Republican Party from actually pursuing this path effectively, right? They were dog whistling, they were using coded language, they were trying to appeal to precisely those people, but not in a way that revealed them to be as bigoted, as hateful, as willing to target minorities and vulnerable people as they actually were trying to convey to some of their supporters, right, was that gentleman's ethos, or the sense that this is also the party of the corporate elite, of the businessmen, of big business, and they don't do stuff like that or say stuff like that. They're too genteel. And so Trump took the kid gloves off, right? That's something that he said in a recent election, or took the gloves off, right? This is now bare knuckle fighting. And um, I think on the one hand, yes, that this is making our politics meaner. It's making our politics more vicious, more potentially violent, more volatile. It is also repellent to a substantial number of people who might otherwise vote Republican. Right. So it is a double-edged sword. It's not just, I think, the liberals who are really upset when, one of the proposals is to create detainment centers to round up 10 million illegal immigrants, right? And I believe that the rule of law is still sufficiently intact in the United States that will never happen. That involves shredding the Constitution. But having said that, it's a campaign promise. Trump didn't build the wall, but he got millions of people to chant, build the wall, and vote for him as a result. Now he's talking about the next most extreme thing, or perhaps the even more extreme thing: build the detention centers, right? And he's doing that because it works to motivate his voters, but there are a fair number of people who it may turn away. I don't think we should rely on Trump proving himself to be so repugnant to his erstwhile potential supporters that he loses this election primarily because, in order to get his base, he pushes away the swing. But that's one possibility. I just would like to open up for Biden, or whoever replaces Biden, if that scenario comes to pass. I don't think it will. An alternative that takes some of the wind out of the sails and positions our politics in a place where it's a little bit less vehement, a little bit less targeted at people to blame, and a little bit more hopeful, a little bit more constructive. That's the claim I'm making. And Flossie, I think you're absolutely right. We should be distressed, in particular, as Trump seemingly deliberately reproduces the language of fascists in his rallies. All right, we've gone way over time, and I know we're having fun, and well, fun, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but we are enjoying talking about this stuff. I will let you go. I hope you'll have good weeks. Happy holidays to those of you who celebrate Hanukkah, and look forward to talking with you, picking up right where we left off. Let's make a mental note. We were halfway through Levitsky and Zablat's recommendations. We'll look at the other half and then keep going next week. Take care, everybody. Be well, and see you in a week. Thanks very much. Enjoy your weekends. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.